Now, the focus has been very much, as indeed in the invitation, on the concept of remedial secession. Now, it's no question that the Tamils have the right of remedial secession, but, and that is a problem with international law in general, it is not self-executing. It is not automatic. The fact that you have a right, the fact that that right is anchored in the UN Charter, that that right is very much the essence of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, Article 1. I mean, that doesn't mean you're going to get it. It is mostly a political matter. Now, who has gotten it? Who has invoked remedial secession? Well, Kosovo got it, and Eritrea got it, and Timor-Leste got it. But who didn't get it? And had also very strong arguments of remedial secession. Well, if you remember well, in the course of the decolonization of the Indian subcontinent, the Kashmiris have been subjected to such crimes against humanity for decades, notwithstanding Security Council Resolution 47, nothing. If the major powers do not support it, you don't get it. Who didn't get it either? We've had a couple of cases from Africa mentioned here, Southern Cameroons and Congo, etc. Look, much worse, many times worse, was the genocide against the Igbos and the Ogonis of Biafra. That was the Nigerian civil war of 1967 to 1970. 2 million dead, something horrendous. But Royal Shell had enormous oil interest in Biafra, and nobody supported the human rights of these Ogonis and Igbos. They were just massacred and nobody cared. Look at the Palestinians. Look at the boobies of the island of Fernando Po, which is the island of Bioko. It was artificially joined with Equatorial Guinea. There are different ethnic groups that have nothing to do with Equatorial Guinea. When Spain decided to release them into independence, instead of releasing them separately, here is one colony, Bioko, here's another colony, Equatorial Guinea, and they both emerge in self-determination. Now, they join them together. So the poor boobies exchange the colonial power, which used to be Spain, and they got another colonial power, which is today Equatorial Guinea, and nobody cares. And then, of course, you have the Mapuches of Chile. They're 800,000, nearly a million. Huh? They have been not only dispossessed, humiliated, massacred, the Mapuches of Argentina too. Nobody cares. So they have a right to remedial secession, but they're not getting it. That's why I have my, shall we say, doubts about the usefulness of always focusing on self-determination on the basis of remedial secession, because where's the threshold? How much violence, how much violation of human rights must occur so that you go right over the threshold and then you have the right. Especially when you realize that even if you go over the threshold and the Tamils have gone way over the threshold, you still don't get it. So that is probably giving yourself hopes that are not backed up by political will. I think that it's far more important to rely on what our colleague, the Honorable Rudra Kamarana, already said at the very beginning. He talked about the League of Nations. He talked about the Åland Islands case. He didn't mention, but indirectly, United Nations Charter Article 39. That is the determination that a situation constitutes a threat or a breach of international peace and security. That is the crucial issue that has to be argued. And it must be clear to everybody that the unjust denial of self-determination, that constitutes a threat to international peace and security. And we have that unjust denial of self-determination in the case of Kashmir, in the case of the Biafrans, in the case of the Bubis, in the case of the Palestinians, in the case of the Kurds. As you probably know, the Kurds held a self-determination referendum in 2017, which was overwhelmingly for self-determination, for secession from Iraq. Did they get it? No. I mean, it's a disgrace. But this is what I say to my students. International law is not applied uniformly. It is applied a la carte. Today we apply it this way, tomorrow we apply it that way. And there are some principles that then get in the public eye and people start talking about these concepts. One of them being the remedial secession of Kosovo because of the ethnic cleansing, et cetera, through Serbia. Now, here is an avenue for the Tamils if you can get several states to demand in the General Assembly a resolution under Article 96 of the UN Charter to ask an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice similar to the advisory opinion that the International Court of Justice gave in February 2019 in the Chagos Island case. That was a case that was presented, or rather, the question was formulated by Mauritius, because the decolonization of Mauritius by the United Kingdom was highly dysfunctional, was highly improper, contrary to international law. So the questions that were, here's the advisory opinion, questions that were presented was the process of decolonization of Mauritius lawfully completed when Mauritius was granted independence in 1968, following the separation of the Chagos Archipelago? Second question, what are the consequences under international law, including obligations reflected in the above mentioned resolutions, arising from the continued administration of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, of the Chagos Islands, etc., by a decision of 14-1. So it's almost unanimous. And of course, who was odd man out? My dear Judge, John Donoghue, the American. It's the same as the decision back in the advisory opinion 2004 on the wall being built on Palestine territory by Israel. And that again went 14-1. Who was the one? My Judge Thomas Bergenthal, the American. So in any event, you see that America tries to have its own rules-based international order, meaning our order. We give the orders and you follow them. In any event, what did the International Court of Justice say in Chagos Island? The court holds that the decolonization of Mauritius was not conducted in a manner consistent with the right of peoples to self-determination. It follows that the United Kingdom's continued administration of the Chagos Islands constitutes a wrongful act entailing the international responsibility of that state. It is an unlawful act of continuing character which arose as a result of the separation of the Chagos archipelago from Mauritius. And they conclude, the court concludes that the United Kingdom has an obligation to bring to an end its administration of the Chagos archipelago as rapidly as possible, and that all member states must cooperate with the United Nations to complete the decolonization of Mauritius. I think the decolonization of Sri Lanka was improper. I think the United Nations should have insisted on a self-determination referendum. And the two major peoples living in the island of Sri Lanka, the Tamils and the Sinhalese, could have separated in a friendly manner. It could have been done to promote international peace and security, but the opportunity was lost. That doesn't mean they cannot be done again now. I mean, I think, and I have said so in my book published last September, Building a Just World Order, Clarity Press, September 2021. There, I formulated 25 principles of international order. And in those 25 principles, I put number one, of course, peace. Pax optima rerum. I mean, that is the main reason, the raison d'etre of the United Nations. That's why we're there for. But principle number 10 is the right of self-determination as a conflict prevention strategy. I mean, what is the most noble goal of the United Nations is to guarantee world peace. And you guarantee world peace by having an early warning system, like already in one of the earlier webinars that were held, and the Honorable Rudra Kumaran spoke in that one too, proposing a transitional government of Tamil Eelam and an international court on self-determination. I mean, we could have an international court on self-determination. I have proposed in my book that a special rapporteur of the Human Rights Council be appointed just on the issue of self-determination, because it comes up not only in the context of Sri Lanka and the Tamils. There are many aspirants to self-determination, among them the Rapa Nuis, the West Papuans, the Aceh Sumatrans, so many indigenous peoples who have not had self-determination, who have not had the opportunity to participate in the conduct of public affairs in their respective countries. Of course, the genocide that was committed against the Tamils makes the claim of the Tamils to secession much stronger, much more persuasive. But there again, being realistic, you're not going to get it unless you have a couple of major powers supporting your right of self-determination. And unless you have the media. Unfortunately, there is what I call the corporate media, the conglomerates, and there's very little plurality in the media these days. So there are what I call the narrative managers who filter all the news And if they don't find the issue of the Tamils interesting, well, the people are not going to find out about it. It's only going to be for webinars and for experts who, at some point or other, are exposed to this. But it's, yeah, it is crucial to win what I call the information war. You must get your case understood. Your case must be studied in colleges and universities. It must be discussed in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, in the Wall Street Journal, in CNN and Fox and CBC and the BBC and the Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung and the Neue Zürcher Zeitung. And unfortunately, it's just not considered interesting enough. So my proposals, because I don't want to take all the time available, is to mobilize some sympathetic states in the General Assembly in order to adopt a resolution on the issue of self-determination for the Tamils and elevate the two questions that were asked about the improper decolonization of Mauritius. How about having the same question, the improper decolonization of Sri Lanka, and what is the way forward? How can we ensure that both the Sinhalese and the Tamils have their human rights and their self-determination? That is a noble function for the Secretary General of the United Nations to offer his good offices in order to facilitate a self-determination referendum, to monitor the self-determination referendum, as the United Nations did in Sudan, as the United Nations did in Timor-Leste, as the United Nations did in Ethiopia, Eritrea. But my concern, and it is a concern that goes way beyond the genocide in Sri Lanka. My concern is that the decolonization process in Africa and Asia was so improper that, unfortunately, there are many aspirants to self-determination who don't have it. And if we don't address their claims in a timely fashion, we are risking that there's going to be violence down the road. So you need a special rapporteur on self-determination. You also need a special advisor to the Secretary General of the United Nations on the issue of self-determination. He is the one, he or she should have the mandate to really understand all of the potential conflicts in the world, to be a whistleblower, if you want, to do early warning so that the United Nations can take prompt and effective action. But going back to this initial question of the importance of the concept of remedial secession, don't rely on it exclusively, because, as I said, it's been denied to many others who also have the claim. I think the stronger claim is a claim based on human dignity. It's a claim based on the very essence of human rights. And that is actually the language used by the drafters of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, because they're in Article 1, Paragraph 1. It is said very clearly, all peoples have the right of self-determination. Not even the right to self-determination, but the right of self-determination now, not tomorrow, now. So all peoples have the right to self-determination. And then paragraph 3 says that all states, parties to the ICCPR and parties to the ICISC, have an obligation to promote the realization of the right of self-determination. So it's not just that the states shouldn't create problems, should not create obstacles. They actually have to proactively promote it. And that is not what is happening. That is not what we're seeing in the world today. And one last thought, the argument used by Sri Lanka about the sacrosanct principle of territorial integrity. That point was conclusively answered by the International Court of Justice in the advisory opinion on Kosovo, paragraph 80. Read it. It's a pretty long paragraph, but the bottom line is you cannot use the principle of territorial integrity to frustrate the exercise of the right of self-determination. You can't do it. It says it specifically that in all of United Nations action, in all of United Nations resolutions, even in the Helsinki Final Act, whenever the concept of territorial integrity is used, it is exclusively for external application. Meaning, state A cannot invade and annex state B, cannot encroach on the territorial integrity of state B. But state A cannot deny its own population, the people living under its jurisdiction, the right to self-determination. That must be underlined. You must read this paragraph 80 because it has enormous implications in the case of Sri Lanka, as indeed it has in the case of, say, the Catalans. The Catalans also have a claim to self-determination, and that must be recognized. Again, thank you.
My name is Jack McLaren. I am a former member of provincial parliament in the province of Ontario. I was the liaison at that time between the PC Party of Ontario and the Tamil people of Ontario. I came to know many Tamils who are living in Canada. I have learned about their struggle for freedom and self-determination in Sri Lanka, which is their homeland. I have learned about the terrible civil war in Sri Lanka that ended in defeat for the Tamil people, whose liberation fighting forces were decimated at the end of the civil war in 2009. Canada wrongfully designated the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam as terrorists in 2006. The Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam are freedom fighters, not terrorists. Now, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam are gone. They were annihilated in 2009. They will never be a force again. But the terrorist designation still exists in Canada. This designation is a large and oppressive black cloud over the heads of Tamil people in Canada. This stigmatization prevents Tamil people from being able to freely stand up and be proud of their history, their culture, and their rightful place in Canadian civilization. But the terrorist designation still exists in Canada. This designation is a large and oppressive black cloud over the heads of Tamil people in Canada. This stigmatization prevents Tamil people from being able to freely stand up and be proud of their history, their culture, and their rightful place in Canadian society. It is time to correct a wrong. It is time for Canada to remove the terrorist designation from the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam. It is time for Canada to recognize Tamil people as good citizens and good neighbors.
A very good day to all of you. Would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak at the International Conference on Tamil Liberation Struggle for Self-Determination, 20 years after the ceasefire agreement 2002 to 2022, organized by the Coalition for Tamil Political Rights in Toronto, Canada, February 18 to 19, 2022. My name is Kalainila Kalayarasu, and I am speaking to you from Malaysia on the title Legal Implications on Malaysians Post-Tamil Eelam War. A little bit about myself. I am an advocate and solicitor in Malaysia, and I am a part of the legal team that is involved in the case Balamurugan Veerasamy against the Ministry of Home Affairs here in Malaysia. The legal battle in Malaysia began when 12 Malaysian Tamil were arrested in the October of 2019 under the Special Offences Special Measures Act 2012, with charges preferred against them under the Penal Code for alleged terrorist activities, including giving support to LTTE in an event and giving support to LTTE using social media. Amongst them was Balamurugan Veerasamy, who is a Malaysian Tamiler who advocated against the plights of Tamiler locally and in Sri Lanka. He, along with others, were detained in solitary confinement for that period. As this incident unfolded in 2019, we did further research only to be surprised by the fact that the LTTE was listed as a specified entity under the Anti-Money Laundering, Anti-Terrorism Financing and Unlawful Activities Act 2001. The Anti-Money Laundering Act requires a 6-month periodic review of the specified entity list, and this is decided by the Ministry of Home Affairs. As early as 2007, the Malaysian Parliament was referring to the LTTE as a separatist movement, and this is found in the Hansard of Parliament during that time. Commemoration events of the struggle in Tamil Eelam were widely held around Malaysia, and these were supervised by the police. There have been no untoward incidents throughout the years, which is why it became even more of a surprise when these events were later used against some of the 12 that were detained in October of 2019. On the pretext that they had advocated for a terrorist group. Not long after the arrest of Balamurugan, we had filed a judicial review application against the decision of the Home Affairs Ministry to list the entity in November 2014. The application was filed in January of 2020, and within a month or so, the 12 were released under the Attorney General Chamber's instructions. Therefore, when the matter came up for hearing in the High Court of Malaya in Kuala Lumpur, one of the reasons cited for the dismissal of the application was that Balamurugan no longer had a locus to bring about the application, seeing as he had now been released. The other factor cited by the court was that any judicial review application should have been brought within 3 months of a decision being made by a public authority. And this would have meant that it should have been done 3 months after November 2014. We are now appealing this decision, and the matter is slated to be heard in April of 2022. What is unique about this arrest is that all 12 Malaysians who were arrested were not of Sri Lanka or Tamil Eelam origin. They are Malaysian Tamils who have been second or third generation Malaysians living here in Malaysia. Most of them had history of advocating for social and political rights in their own way, and we believe that they were used as a political tool in the context of what was happening in Malaysia at that point of time. In 2018, there was a massive change in the environment here, whereby the opposition party, the opposition coalition, had for the first time overturned the ruling government. And in February of 2020, there was a change in government again due to various leaders party hopping and thus creating a new coalition which formed the new government. If this is seen in the context of Malaysian politics at that time, then we will observe also that two of the 12 that were arrested were members of the ruling government. It must be noted that in the High Court's decision dismissing the judicial review application, the court did not go into the merits of the application per se. The Attorney General at that time released a media statement upon the release of the 12 from custody. After the arrest of the 12, civil rights movements and political groups had organized various events demanding the release of the 12. It included protests, it included holding vigil for the 12 and their families, protests, dialogues, and a massive call to release the 12. There was a petition circulated to demand the release of the 12 and to remove the listing from the specified entity list. These petitions were signed off by at least 30,000 people and were handed over to the Home Affairs Ministry. On a general observation, we are witnessing individuals who are affiliated with their home country's political ideology connected to the Elam struggle, having overstayed their welcome in Singapore. Closer to home, Balamurugan's family and friends who had been working in Singapore have been refused entry to the country due to their affiliation to him, some having lost their PR of 25 years without any criminal record. We see a Tamiler phobia spreading across at government administrations in Southeast Asia. It is our humble opinion that we need to bring about a global confidence against this mindset in Asia, which will bring about a transformation in legal implications across the board. Once again, I thank you for having me here. It has been a great opportunity to be a part of this conference. Nandri Vanakkam.
Morning, afternoon to everybody. Vanakkam. Hello, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to speak at this conference. As Sivandan mentioned, my topic, improper decolonization in the creation of Sri Lanka, was inspired by Dr. Desai's recent talk at the event organized by ABC Tamiloli. During his speech, he mentioned that Sri Lanka could be considered a case of improper decolonization. He further mentioned that it might be like the legal case that Mauritius brought to the International Court of Justice regarding the right of self-determination of the Chagosian people who were either denied the right of reentry or forcibly removed from the Chagos Islands. I believe that if we look at how Sri Lanka was formed in the first place, this argument holds up very strongly. I'll talk about what effects that has on the de-proscription of the Tamil freedom movement. Improper decolonization took place because the 1948 decolonization of Ceylon did not restore territorial title to the sovereign Tamil people. It gave territorial title over the whole island to the numerical majority, the Sinhalese. Countries like Canada inherit the colonial mentality because they view the construct of Sri Lanka as natural, rather than understanding it to be a measure imposed by the colonizers in 1833. Canada is not a disinterested party. It shares a common legal structure, political structure, and Commonwealth history with the British mother country due to a different history of decolonization for Canada than for Sri Lanka. The island colony of Ceylon should not have been decolonized as a single political unit without any regard to the ethnic groups contained within its borders, though this had worked for some other countries whose borders were created by colonialism. The process of decolonization as a result of the 1833 Cameron-Colbert Commission's merger is incomplete and improper. The price of that incomplete process of decolonization is the decades of strife and uprisals of the Tamils, the Mullawaikal massacre, and a war traumatized people. The island gained independence from the British colonial presence for the creation of the Dominion of Ceylon on February 4th, 1948, when Ceylon was given independence from colonial rule. Great Britain had merged the Sinhala and Tamil populations together into one political and administrative unit. So I'll start by talking about the British colonial activity that formed this single political unit, the Colbert-Cameron Commission's recommendations of 1833. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, the commission made the following recommendations. 1, that the formerly absolute power of the governor of Ceylon be limited by a separation of the executive, legislative, and judicial authorities, a step that would entail the creation of an executive council, which was to act jointly with the governor in decision-making, and a legislative council, which was to include some native Ceylonese members. 2, that all of Ceylon be united under one administrative system. 3, that more civil service posts be open to natives. 4, that a uniform judicial system be created to promote greater efficiency and equal treatment before the law of Ceylonese and Europeans. 5, that Rajakarya, the traditional system of land tenure, be abolished, along with government trade monopolies. And 6, that a uniform system of education be developed with English as the medium of instruction. As we can see, all these reforms, but especially recommendation 2, influence the sovereignty of the Tamil people. The Colbert-Cameron recommendations form part of what was then known as the Commission of Eastern Inquiry. According to Dr. Niranjan Kasinather, Dr. Roshan De Silva Vijayaratna, and Professor Lee Godin, the Commission of Eastern Inquiry was set up during a time of criticism against the British colonization, at a time when the practice of slavery was also being abolished in the British Empire. And they write, and I quote, the Commission of Eastern Inquiry was established by the Westminster Parliament to study the state of colonial government in 3 colonies, the Cape Colony, now South Africa, Mauritius, and Ceylon. The commission was to focus on each colony as a whole, but with special consideration of the structures and cost of the civil government, the economy, and the administration of justice, end quote. So the mixing of 3 very different regions of the globe into one single Eastern Inquiry was even thought to be strange at that long time ago. Sir Edward Barnes, the governor of Ceylon at the time, wrote to the British Secretary of State as follows, and I quote, "I am most thoroughly convinced of the staggering effect on the minds of the people of this country, so different from those of the Cape of Good Hope and Mauritius," end quote. The British governor of Ceylon himself thought it was strange, even at that time, that the inquiry should lump such very different peoples together over such vast distances who had little in common with each other and did not see each other as being the same. Holden Ferber wrote in 1958 that, and I quote, "The reforms adopted in Ceylon in 1832 to 34 were indeed far-reaching and unprecedented according to the standards of the day," end quote. So we can see that already there is a parallel between our situation and the situation of Mauritius and the Chagos Islands. In fact, the recommendation that merged the Sinhala and Tamil nations into a single colonial unit was also part of an inquiry that made recommendations on the status of Mauritius all the way back in the 1830s. I should make clear that the paper I've quoted a little while ago by Dr. Kasinather, Dr. De Silva Wijeyaratne, and Professor Godden is problematic because it seems to take a biased position, only making reference to one of the pre-colonial kingdoms that were in existence on the island, the Kandyan kingdom, ignoring the other pre-colonial Tamil kingdoms. Moreover, this article establishes the Tamil presence on the island as only going back to the year 1800 AD. The truth is that the Tamil presence on the island goes back much further. Even with its shortcomings, this source admits, and I quote, "The historical legacy of the Colbert-Cameron reforms has been an over-centralization of the state that has enabled the numerical supremacy of the Sinhalese Buddhist community to fashion a state, as well as a constitutional order that has systematically ostracized minority communities on the island. Such has been the marginalization of the Tamil minority, in particular, that it took to arms for a considerable period of the recent past. Bearing in mind contemporary attempts at constitutional reform in Canada, this interrogation of the Colbert-Cameron reforms is a prescient reminder to Sinhalese nationalists that when they valorize the centralized state, they fetishize what was a British colonial creation," end quote. When Thandai Selva, SJV Selvanayagam, drafted the Vattukota Resolution in 1976, I believe the Tamil people had a very similar reading of the situation. The preamble to the Vattukota Resolution reads, I'm not going to read the whole thing, parts of it, and I quote, "The British colonists who ruled the territories of the Sinhalese and Tamil kingdoms separately joined under compulsion the territories of the Sinhalese and the Tamil kingdoms for purposes of administrative convenience on the recommendation of the Colbert Commission in 1833. Further, the Tamil leaders were in the forefront of the freedom movement to rid Ceylon of colonial bondage, which ultimately led to the grant of independence to Ceylon in 1948. And yet, the foregoing facts of history were completely overlooked, and power over the entire country was transferred to the Sinhalese nation on the basis of a numerical majority, thereby reducing the Tamil nation to the position of subject people," end quote. Selvanayagam was also made it clear that the Tamil kingdom was overthrown in war and conquered by the Portuguese in 1619, and from them by Dutch and the British in turn, independent of the Sinhalese kingdoms, end quote. So in the Vattukota Resolution, he was making the argument that the Tamil people had never voluntarily given up their freedom. As a result, the people of Tamil Eelam were voting to re-establish their sovereignty in the vote of 1977. In fact, even though King Sangali was overthrown in 1619 by the Portuguese, Tamil kings continued to resist colonization for another 200 years. According to DGB De Silva, a Sinhalese historian of the Vineyard Kings, he wrote, and I quote, "The Dutch resorted to the practice of retaining one Venya at a time as a hostage in Jaffna fort in order to ensure their obedience and the payment of tribute. This practice of keeping hostages to keep the Venyas under control appears to have been an ancient practice coming down from the Dambadhanaya period," end quote. Dambadhanaya was a Sinhala kingdom, which was later headquartered at the world-famous Sigiriya Rock Castle. So we see that even during the Dutch colonization, colonizers' control of the Tamil population was needed, relying, of course, on the methods that were developed by hostile neighboring Sinhalese kingdoms. National leader Velupillai Prabhakaran stated in a Tamil language interview that the cross bayonets of the flag of Tamil Eelam were taken from the cross swords of the flag of Pandaravenniyan. Pandaravenniyan, of course, was the last Tamil king to rule on the island of Ceylon, a leader who resisted foreign colonial oppression. The region he ruled from, the Venni, later became the territorial base from which the LTTE and the civil administration of Tamalulam operated. King Pandaravenian took back a great deal of territory from the British colonizers for a short time. This included the British garrison in Mullaitivu, as well as attacks on British forces in Batticaloa and Elephant Pass. He was ambushed and later killed by British soldiers in 1810. This was only 13 years before the Colebrook-Cameron Commission. So this very short snippet of colonial history gives us an insight into why the Tamil nation's efforts at exercising the right of self-determination are banned in so many Western democracies, the same countries where we now live, work, and vote. Canada's ban on advocacy for the LTTE is rooted in the colonial need to violently repress the Tamil people's leadership, a leadership that has always resisted foreign colonization. Now, before I connect the dots between colonial history, the ban on advocating Tamil self-determination, and improper decolonization, I need to first answer the question, from where did today's bans come? So in 2002, the LTTE and the Sri Lankan government signed a ceasefire agreement. The ceasefire outlined provisional borders for the de facto state of Tamalulam based on the LTTE's effective control over territory. In the agreement, these borders were described as the forward positions of the two armies. The ceasefire came as a welcome relief from years of Sri Lankan government aggression against the Tamil people. It was during this time that both the Sri Lankan president and the international news agencies began to describe a separate Tamil de facto state existing in the north and east of the island. And yet, while the Sri Lankan government put on a show of engaging in negotiations with the LTTE, the same Sri Lankan government was busy slandering the Tamil leadership in international forums. In the early 2000s, the Western discourse of a new war on terror suddenly became useful to the Sri Lankan state. On one hand, Tamil political leaders were meeting with representatives of governments from other nation states and were trying to build up institutions of Tamil self-governance, while on the other hand, the Sri Lankan army was busy using the ceasefire to upgrade its weaponry and military training, while the government painted Tamils seeking their freedoms as terrorists, recruiters of child soldiers, and extortionists. When Canada banned the LTT in 2006, former Conservative cabinet minister Peter MacKay said, and I quote, "The LTTE's repeated use of violence since signing a ceasefire agreement is unacceptable and seriously calls into question its commitment to the peace process," end quote. But it was the Sri Lankan government, not the LTTE, who broke the ceasefire that year, withdrawing from it fully in 2008, of course. In the same statement, MacKay accurately cited the figure that over 60,000 people had been killed in the war to date. He left out the fact that they were mostly Tamil civilian victims and mostly killed by the Sri Lankan government. Canadian newspapers told stories of Tamil gang violence in Scarborough, falsely linking these traumatized and marginalized young men to the LTTE. The Toronto police at the time established the Tamil Task Force to target young Tamils for surveillance. The LTTE was accused of drug trafficking and procuring Tamil women for prostitution. When refugees arrived on Canadian shores on the MV Sunsea and the Ocean Lady, those who organized the dangerous voyages to save people's lives were accused of human trafficking. None of these allegations were true. Canada now accepts this reality. Yet only the stigma against Tamil political expression and the lies about the LTTE remain. These bans on Tamil political expression across the West were the effect of Sri Lanka tapping into old British and European colonial prejudices against Tamils. The colonial mentality said that Tamil kings, like King Pandaravenian, were violent and dangerous, and that the Tamil people could only be controlled by keeping them politically unified with the larger Sinhalese population. This colonial mentality was then applied to the LTTE, who deliberately drew on the history of Tamil sovereignty and resistance. This colonial strategy of forcible unification between Sinhalese and Tamils ended in the Mullaitivu massacre. Preserving the anti-Tamil, inappropriately created British colonial state structure was Sri Lanka's aim when it argued for the ban on the LTTE across the Western world, where many Tamils live after fleeing from Sri Lanka. The British decision to unify the Tamils and Sinhalese on the island on their egress was the root cause for all the domestic insurgency. The Sinhalese need or want to oppress the Tamil minority peoples, and the Tamils need to resist the oppression from the unwanted forced unification and lack of recognition of the traditional integrity of the Tamils' lands and sovereignty. So we can see that a proper decolonization process of the island would have seen how unjust it was to unify the two nations of the island into a single state. Proper decolonization would have permitted the Tamils and Sinhalese to vote for themselves, whether to decolonize as a single political unit or to separate and live side by side in peace. The ban on the LTTE does more than just criminalize Tamil identity. It is even more than a cruel way to deny Tamil political expression. What it actually does is to reinforce the history of humiliation by European and Sri Lankan armies. It legitimizes the massacres that those armies committed against Tamils. It denies that Tamils were a self-determining people long before there was a country called Sri Lanka and long before Europeans colonized the island. The ban is intended to criminalize even the memory that Tamils once held a state of their own, the memory that they ever existed, the right of self-determination, and the memory of Tamils' long history and proud culture. As a result of the ban on the LTTE in several countries, the military playing field was tilted against the Tamil people. Tens of thousands of Tamils paid the price for that unfair ban with their lives. It's time for those countries to begin making amends for the horrifying damage that their actions made possible. Alfred de Zayas states in his book that a persistent obstacle to the realization of the right to self-determination of peoples has been the adamant insistence of some states not to negotiate with peoples living within their frontiers. We've witnessed this in the case of Sri Lanka, where as a sequel of an improper decolonization process, the Tamils and the Sinhalese were kept together in the island of Sri Lanka instead of conducting a referendum to determine whether the Tamils and the Sinhalese were prepared to live together in one state or whether they preferred to emerge as two equal sovereign entities. What has made the situation worse is the aggravating factor that the Sri Lankan government has wrongly labeled the Tamils as terrorists and contributed to the false narrative that the Tamils do not have a right to self-determination because they're terrorists, end quote. Later, he continued to say that the narrative managers in the mainstream media bear considerable responsibility for the negative perception of national liberation movements as somehow terroristic. So the ban on the LTTE and on Tamil political expression need to be lifted. They're based in a long history of oppression against Tamils that needs to end. One way of ending that history is to make arguments like the Chagosian people of Mauritius that we're a self-determining people who have rights, that we are a self-determining people who have rights under international law, and that we are owed a process of proper decolonization as we were denied this opportunity in 1948 when Great Britain left the island and chose to unify the peoples on the land into one single political and administrative unit. Remember the Vatukota Resolution, which was a referendum taken by delimiting the territory of Tamil Eelam on the basis that this was the area of historic habitation for the Tamil people, formerly ruled by Tamil sovereigns. It was not until 1833, when the Colbert-Cameron Commission merged the two different sovereigns' territories, that the Tamil region of the island was even considered politically subsumed into a larger British colonial unit known as Ceylon. My speech today was inspired by Alfred de Zayas, and I will close with a quote from his recent book again, and I quote, "Alas, since the Second World War and the Nuremberg trials, hundreds of wars have had the origin in the unjust denial of the right to self-determination of peoples. The world witnessed the criminal efforts of colonial powers to hold on to their colonies, the continuing exploitation of indigenous peoples, and the looting of their resources, the oppression by occupying powers over native populations. the implantation of settlers in order to change the demographics of a territory, the suppression of languages, cultural manipulations tantamount to cultural destruction, the erasing of historical memory, and the adamant denial of autonomy or secession to peoples who had and have a legitimate right to determine their own future, end quote. As was done in 2017 when the General Assembly adopted Resolution 71-292, requesting an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice concerning the incomplete decolonization of Mauritius, we too have a valid claim to work toward a similar resolution requesting an advisory opinion of the ICJ, and we must work toward this. All of the turmoil that the Tamil ancestors went through and brethren go through today are a direct effect of the incorrect and improper decolonization by Great Britain of the island that is called Sri Lanka today. I thank you, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, and good morning to you all. Thank you for joining us for this crucial and global discussion. Just to confirm, can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Just a little bit about myself. My name is Sharithi Ramesh, commonly known as Shaya. I am currently a fourth-year undergraduate student at the University of Toronto for evolutionary anthropology and minoring in sociology of genocide. I'm the author of 3 publications, a record label producer, and I especially strive to write about the struggles of Elam Tamils, both during and after the Sri Lankan War. But most importantly, I am part of the Tamil diaspora here in Canada, and I'm here to share my perspectives and ideas as a youth leader. As always, my presentation will be delivered in English as we're speaking to an international conference, and because I address you as a diasporic Tamil youth. I'd also like to give a warning for possibly triggering content, as there may be brief mentions of sexual assault, violence, and other mature subject matter. Some of our audience may be survivors of war or assault, or they may be minors, so I ask that you keep in mind your mental well-being throughout the discussion, please. Viewers' discretion is advised. I also highly suggest that viewers take notes of the discussion that we have today. We have some amazing speakers here, influential figures who specialize in what they bring to the table. And what we have to say is valuable knowledge in all aspects of foreign policy, the characteristics of genocide, and ethnic cleansing. And I'm speaking from an international perspective from the viewpoints of a professional in my own field. I'm purposely leading my portion as a lecture-style online seminar for that reasoning. My presentation will touch on the classification of genocide, how it pertains to Elam Tamils, and the inclusion of diasporic youth in the fight for change. Specifically, the information I am bringing to this conference is for the benefit of the diaspora and students around the globe. Now, I was born and raised on Canadian soil, but my connection with my ethnic culture has always been strong. I was a toddler when the ceasefire agreement of 2002 had been drawn, but I remember attending my first protest march before the Mulivaikal massacre at 8 years of age. I remember hearing the news when the war finally concluded, and I remember always thinking and wondering, why did this happen? Why did the Sri Lankan state decide to take such violent measures against the people they were sworn to protect? In order to understand how the Tamil genocide came into existence, we need to make connections between articles in place and the inhumane treatment of Elam Tamils. That begins with identifying the attributes of genocide. We tend to speak about genocide in a broad scope. The term that was coined by Raphael Lemkin in 1944, which broken up translates roughly to race killing. In Article 2 of the Convention, the UN defines genocide as, start quote, any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, such as 1. Killing members of the group, 2. Causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, 3. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, 4. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and 5. Forcibly transferring children of the group to another group, end quote. I would also like to define what is cultural genocide as it pertains to the Tamil genocide. And I also pulled this definition from the UN as well. Begin quote, any deliberate act committed with the intention of destroying the language, religion, or culture of a group, such as, for example, prohibiting the use of the group's language or its schools or places of worship, end quote. In simple terms, it is the deliberate eradication of a national culture, which is clearly the case in Sri Lanka, as the government continues to deny the rights of Ilim Tamils to this day. Next, I'd like to outline the 10 stages of genocide as developed by Gregory Stanton. This is essentially an early warning system, if you will, to alert us of the signs of potential future genocides. There are 7 early warning aspects and 3 active aspects in order, and I will put them in the chat. They go as classification, symbolization, persecution, extermination, dehumanization, organization, polarization, preparation, and denial. I'm just putting them in the chat now for those who are taking notes. Now, because I do not have much time to go for each and every single sign, I urge you all to do some independent research into this early warning system. But I'd like to point out the 3 stages that really resonate with the ongoing genocide of Tamils. Discrimination is the first, and perhaps one of the most crucial stages that we have plausible evidence of. In this, the dominant group asserts their power to deny the rights of the victim group. They may include civil rights, voting rights, and/or citizenship rights. This monopolizing of power is seen in how the predominantly Sinhalese government issued bills and policies to discriminate against the victim group of Tamils by implementing the conditions of life that violate their civil and citizenship rights. Example being the Sinhala Only Bill, established in 1956, which prohibited the Tamil language from being spoken in educational and legal institutions. Now, I ask you to turn your attention to the next stage, dehumanization. That is, the perpetrator group denies the humanity of the victim group. Throughout the genocide, the members of the Tamil ethnicity have been objectified and animalized in Sri Lanka, and the state did and continues to do nothing to stop it. Tamils were not only killed during the war, they were beaten, raped, separated from their families, and psychologically scarred. This was the Sri Lankan state's tactic to eliminate the ethnicity via anti-Tamil programs. Example being the Black July riots of 1983, in which Sinhalese mobs supporting their state had burned, beaten, looted, raped, and killed many Tamils. Lastly, I would like to discuss the final stage, denial. Before this comes extermination, the mass killings that concentrated on individuals of the targeted group. This can evidently be related to the Tamil genocide, specifically the Mullaikal massacre of 2009. But denial is a very important stage where the evidence of crimes against humanity are hidden and or destroyed. This includes the moving and burning of bodies, the destruction of memorial sites, intimidation of witnesses, and or the blocking of investigations. This should all sound familiar, considering it's the exact criteria of denial that the Sri Lankan state continues to follow to this day. We still have no idea what happened to a majority of Tamils missing since the end of the war. Many Tamils in Sri Lanka live in constant fear of their oppressors. Our memorial sites and places to honor the dead are constantly vandalized and destroyed every year. There are hotels built over mass graves, and people still praise Sri Lanka as being this friendly vacation paradise. This blatant ignorance is a slap to the face to the Tamil community, invalidating the ethnic cleansing that continues to take place in the country, and it's time for us to set the record straight. So why is this all relevant? The reason I bring up the system by Stanton is that it's important for us to read these studies and educate ourselves in order to bring strength to our cases when we do appeal to speak before the International Criminal Court. It is crucial that we show our evidence, back it up with plausible research and facts, so that it becomes harder for the Sri Lankan state to shut us down. That is, we need to place an emphasis on getting everyone of all generations, especially the diasporic youth, on the same page when it comes to what we know about what happened and what continues to happen, as well as what we can do to prevent it. This could be done through the education system, by teaching students the components of genocide, using the massacre of Tamils as a credible example when taught in secondary and post-secondary education, specifically history courses, seminars of international crime and studies of genocide. We must also clear up the misconception of the LTTE. The naming of this group as a terrorist organization continues to paint Tamil activists in a negative light, criminalizing the ethnic community's members and displays only one side of what happened and still happens in Sri Lanka. It invalidates the genocide against Elam Tamils and gives the impression that Tamils fighting for their basic human rights as terrorists. It's hard enough to find credible information of the genocide online, nonetheless in print. Growing up, I had to go off of my parents' stories, discussions like these, old school documentaries, and knowledge of those I encountered throughout my journey in activism. There's no true textbook to outline the atrocities committed by the Sri Lankan state, and even though there are publications, they're not easily accessible. Thus, we need to incorporate the Tamil perspective in education systems to ensure that our message is being carried across. A step forward that we've taken was the enactment of Bill 104 for Tamil Genocide Education Week, approved by the Governor of Ontario. Each year from May 12th through to the 18th, the community will be encouraged to learn about the mass murders of Elam Tamils, recognizing the war against the Tamil ethnic group in Sri Lanka as physical and cultural genocide. What this teaches us is that we need to encourage politicians and other figures of power to step in and help us carry this case to the international audience. The United Nations has continued to prove itself time and time again, unable to carry out international investigations into the Sri Lankan state's war crimes, despite constant efforts to do so. One of the reasons for this is the political aspect of humanitarian crises. Politics is all about opportunistic cost. That is, democratic governments are responsible for their citizens. But if representatives of such countries see that their civilians want more diplomatic pressures taken against human rights abusers, then parties are more likely to act. Supporting candidates that have aid for international crimes against humanity as a plank in their platform is one way that we can directly help Elam Tamils from our individual corners of the world. Raising our voices is the first step. Getting people to listen is next. Through clubs, discussions, international conferences such as this one, and social media platforms, we can make these resources accessible to all and show the oppressing Sri Lankan state that the diaspora is ready to continue the fight for justice. Now, we have all this evidence of blatant human rights violations before us, yet nothing has really been done to bring these atrocities to light. While I do agree that we need to bring justice for these victims of genocide, I urge the future generation to prioritize the importance of accountability. The Sri Lankan state refuses to take accountability over the hate crimes against Elam Tamils, and only by getting a proper statement of such, we will be able to truly bring justice and closure to the survivors of war. To do this, we must continue to pressure the government to take responsibility. We must share our collective story, share our trauma and history, empathize with other marginalized communities, and fight for Tamils to finally have the right to self-determination. We are not Sri Lankans, and we don't want to be identified with our oppressors. We are Tamil. We deserve the right to have a separate identity and to be heard after spending decades in oppression and fear. And not only for the Tamil community, let's take care of each other, fight for one another's rights, and work together to ensure that genocide is prevented for the sake of our future. So, I invite youth of all ages, of all ethnicities, of all gender identities and sexualities to join the fight against genocide, to share this injustice against this marginalized group in whatever language and method preferred, and do their part to ensure that all of the atrocities committed by the Sri Lankan government, or any government for that matter, by any group, make sure that these crimes against communities will not be repeated. I'm a 21-year-old first generation Canadian, a product of the Tamil diaspora. I'm a writer, a student, a friend, and a daughter. The genocide is part of my history, part of my identity, and it will always influence my perspective and drive for action. We cannot change history. There's no going back to the past, but we can make one to be spoken of in the future, one step at a time. So I thank you all for being present here, for taking the time to listen to the knowledge each person here has to share. I look forward to the discussion that we will be having, and let's join hands to forge a better future starting today. From one leader to the next generation, to all of you, thank you, Nandri.
Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you to the conference organizers for inviting me to participate in this important conference. Today, I will present some of my thoughts and observations for strategic change in Tamil diplomacy, which is by no means exhaustive, but a starting point. I believe that the Tamil advocacy has to become more multifaceted, and the different approaches for justice and accountability should be more strategically aligned and complementary. The current world order is transforming, which may give us a window of opportunity to call for a referendum. But that requires the right strategy for lobbying and advocacy. The world has changed a lot in the last 20 years. Today, we see the geopolitical powers are in a major shakeup. There's a huge rivalry between the USA and China, but also regional and systemic forms of corporations are emerging. They're disrupting the world order as we know it. Our advocacy should reflect the world today, but from my observations, the main Tamil advocacy is still focused on the West. In the past, whenever the West was involved in our struggle, at the major junctions, they have sadly more often failed us than saved us. I think the most obvious example is the white flag incident. The United States and the rest of the international community asked the leaders of the movement to lay down their arms and surrender in 2009. Our leaders did so in order to avoid the slaughter. They surrendered to the Sri Lankan army waving a white flag, and the army killed them. It's a clear act of a war crime, but to date we wait for any kind of justice. We should also take into consideration the fact that mainly Western countries, apart from India and Malaysia, have banned the Tamil freedom struggle by proscribing the LTTE in the aftermath of the global war of terror campaign. These bans were put in place while the ceasefire and peace negotiations were ongoing, also to discredit the legitimacy of the Tamil leadership who were defending the rights of their people. It is a classic approach of divide and conquer. The ceasefire agreement and its Sri Lanka monitoring mission also did not put in place any serious and effective dispute resolution method, such as international arbitration. The lack of a safeguard enabled the government of Sri Lanka to violate the ceasefire agreement before withdrawing from it completely. It gave them time to prepare for their all-out war at a time when the Western world was plunged into a financial crisis. For example, the peace process between Sudan and South Sudan used international arbitration that was binding on both parties. And in that case, the international community made sure that both parties respected this method of resolving issues. Known as the RBE arbitration, it is widely considered a remarkable legal procedure concerning the interpretation and implementation of a peace agreement between a state's government and a secessionist movement. This arbitration agreement was ultimately the guarantee that South Sudan achieved its independence. Coming back to the international community and its behavior towards the Tamil struggle, we have to also add that at the end of the war, the United Nations neglected any form of protection for the Tamil people and allowed a massive onslaught, which we identify as the first genocide of the 21st century. United Nations personnel withdrew from Sri Lanka, enabling that the slaughter took place without witnesses. Our lobbying strategy at the Human Rights Council after the war has ended has not resulted in any kind of justice, accountability, and reparations yet. It seems that too often self-appointed leaders of the diaspora, as well as some elected parliamentarians from the ground, who look with Western countries to limit and deflect our demands for their own political gain and access rights with the powerful in the wealthy Western countries, partly former colonizers. After the end of the war, we have demanded an international independent investigation. But now we are led to believe that sanctions, and those are not even trade sanctions, will get us justice. The report of the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights recommended for member states to explore, quote, Targeted sanctions such as asset freezes and travel bans against credibly alleged perpetrators of grave human rights violations and abuses, quote end. How are travel bans any kind of justice for the many lost in the conflict and those suffering now? Our demands were watered down to the point that we perceive this kind of actions, if they succeed, as a win, a deflection from the main goals and aspirations. I want to remind the audience that the HRC Resolution 30/1 and its subsequent resolutions affirmed that the, quote, credible justice process should include independent judicial and prosecutorial institutions led by individuals known for their integrity and impartiality. This meant a hybrid justice process, including foreign experts. 5 years have gone by and Sri Lanka did not establish any kind of justice mechanism, not even a domestic one. In fact, they just withdraw from their commitments. Instead, the current strategy seems to want to make use of sanctions in conjunction with universal jurisdiction. As a recent event held by the International Truth and Justice Project pointed out, travel bans undermine the exercise of universal jurisdiction. The offender must be on the soil of the prosecuting state in order to be arrested and tried. Travel bans are a way to make sure that the strategy of universal jurisdiction becomes not feasible. Also, many Western governments are slow to use universal jurisdiction against international war criminals, as it may affect their geopolitical and economic interests. However, there are some ongoing cases based on universal jurisdiction in Sweden, Germany, and Finland, which involve alleged war criminals from Iran, Syria, and Liberia. Those are all countries almost completely out of the sphere of the Western influence. Whereas Sri Lanka is right in the middle of geopolitical tensions, and hence the likelihood of pursuing justice via the route of universal jurisdiction seems minimal. The recent Human Rights Council resolution from last year, March, mandates the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights to investigate and collect evidence for future accountability processes for violations of international law. Collecting this evidence is supposed to lead to an application of universal jurisdiction within member states. However, the use of targeted sanctions to penalize alleged war criminals and bans them from traveling cannot meaningfully be used in addition to universal jurisdiction in the same country, as those measures do not complement each other, but block each other. It's important that the Tamil advocacy considers coherent strategies on which approaches to use to achieve accountability. There were also demands to refer Sri Lanka to the International Criminal Court. Only individuals can be referred to the ICC. However, there's a case now filed with the chief prosecutor of the ICC. The ICC submission accuses, amongst others, the current president of Sri Lanka of crimes against humanity, such as deportation, persecution, torture, and violation of the right of return. This would be a small step towards justice if the chief prosecutor decides to investigate. However, we should not expect more support on any kind of ICC referrals from the USA or UK specifically. The USA is not a signatory to the Rome Statute and hence denies the authority of the ICC, whereas the UK has ratified the Rome Statute, but for political reasons will likely not back any referral to the ICC, as both countries harbor their own alleged war criminals for the invasion of Iraq. I think we have to look at the geopolitical realities of the current world. Looking at the state of the West, we can see that the spirits of liberal values and democratic rights are increasingly declining. USA had 4 years of Trump, who has spoken to the right-wing electorate. He built a foundation for fascism to thrive in the USA. During the 2016 election, President Obama told high-ranking Democrats that Donald Trump was a fascist who who must be kept out of the White House. Despite the fact that there's currently a Democratic president at the top, their dealing with the January 6th insurrection shows that the USA is likely on its way to become a fascist country. 20 years ago, a figure like Trump becoming president of the United States was unimaginable. Several countries in Europe, including the United Kingdom, drift into fascist slogans and mentalities. It will be increasingly harder to bring forward any kind of justice for the Tamil people if we solely rely on these countries. What we are seeing now is a change in global power structures. The world is not divided anymore in good and evil as easily, and the West is not the protector of international law and order anymore. It is China which seeks to establish its footprint as a superpower. And it is China who wants to show the image of retaining multilateralism based on international law. However, it needs to be said also that they ignore the system if it does not suit them. But I would like to illustrate the importance of China in the 21st century. China pursues the dream of re-establishing the Middle Kingdom, the rise of the Chinese nation. For that, they are pursuing a holistic strategy, externally as well as internally. Today, China is developing a state-backed digital currency and is years ahead of the USA in this field. They invest heavily in digital infrastructure and are building their presence in cyberspace. They have developed a strategy for space dominance and are now on par with the USA in terms of the number of space missions. They are challenging the West for control of the international system without firing a single shot or dropping a single bomb so far. But at the same time, there are internal military reorganization efforts ongoing to ensure that China will have an effective military which is able to perform military operations and wage successful wars within 30 years from now. This holistic effort of China might enable them to control the narratives of world order. If they succeed in their ambitions, and we as the Tamil people do not have any diplomatic relationship with China, we will struggle to fulfill our aspirations. We all know that Sri Lanka is part of China's Belt and Road Initiative, the global infrastructure development project, which is designed to give China greater influence and leadership in global affairs. Yet, the ancient maritime Silk Road went through Jaffna with the cooperation of the sovereign Tamil kingdom under the Chola Empire. The Chinese voyager Zheng He, with a mandate from the Ming dynasty, set up a stone monument on the island written in Tamil, Persian, and Chinese. He established an agreement of friendship and cooperation with the Tamil-speaking population on the island. This was in 1409, 100 years before Columbus sailed west from Europe to find India and found a continent instead that he called America. The ancient Chinese nation and the ancient Tamil nation saw each other as partners and as equals. Meanwhile, the Sinhala king was arrested by the Chinese government for his crimes. This was in the early 1400s. Coming back to the present, the Chinese ambassador visited the Tamil homeland 2 months ago. He paid his respect to the Tamil people by paying homage to the Nalor temple in Jaffna. It came at a time where Sri Lanka had decided to accept an economic bailout from India to help meet its debt, which meant that the Rajapaksa government was trying to move slowly away from dependence on China. It is possible that China sees the Tamil nation as a counterbalancing force to the Sri Lankan government. India has had a perspective since the late 1970s. It has long used Tamil aspirations to destabilize the Sri Lankan state. It has not actively supported all the resolutions in the Human Rights Council. In order to have some influence over Sri Lanka, India needs friction on the island to assert its interest. It is also true that India's voice has a weight when it comes to a solution for the Tamil national question, as their security interests are concerned. However, when looking at the global geostrategic interest, it is not a given that India will align with the West interest when it comes to Sri Lanka. India is friendly with Russia, and Russia currently plays the role as a global balancer, especially with its position in the Middle East and increasingly Africa. In the Russian-Ukrainian crisis, for example, India sided with Russia. In a diplomatic statement earlier this month, India described itself as challenging the neo-primacy of the US-led Western world. It's again an argument to widen the diplomatic ties with countries outside of the West. Currently, India is in focus again, as there has been outcry from some parts of the Tamil political sphere about the demand for India to pressure Sri Lanka to fully implement the 13th Amendment to its constitution. The 13th Amendment allows Tamils to have some regional self-governance within the Sri Lankan state. We have heard that the parties who back the 13th Amendment want to keep the Tamil nation locked into the Sri Lankan state. And we also know that the provincial council system under the 13th Amendment is not equal to an independent Tamil state. Those who oppose the implementation of the 13th Amendment have the opportunity to become strong voices for a referendum on Tamil statehood. Until a referendum decides otherwise, the mandate of the radical resolution stands. The Tamil people's will is to be an independent nation with a state of their own. Sri Lanka is an economic failure. This fact is an embarrassment for its Chinese protectors. China was at the side of Sri Lanka from the days of the war with the expectation that the end of the war would bring stability and prosperity to the island. This partly explains their huge investment into Sri Lanka. More importantly, China has been a protector at the Human Rights Council for Sri Lanka since at least 2009. Now, there's no economic stability for investors in Sri Lanka, including Chinese investors. Many foreign observers and even the Sri Lankan government have realized that the solution comes from the business acumen and international connections of the Tamil diaspora. It comes from our power to help international investors realize rewards for their risk. We must demand in return for our contribution to the financial and political stabilization of the region for the global investment community, diplomatic recognition for an independent state of our own. We have to become partners. When we control the narrative, we control the outcome. The honorable leader of the LTTE said following in his Marbrianal speech in 1993, I'm quoting a translation, "We are fully aware that the world is not rotating on the axis of human justice. Every country in this world advances its own interests. It is the economic and trade interests that determine the order of the present world, not the moral law of justice, nor the rights of people. International relations and diplomacy between countries are determined by such interests. Therefore, we cannot expect an immediate recognition of the moral legitimacy of our cause by the international community." Quote end. This wisdom is now even more important than it was almost 30 years ago, as the global power structures are shifting. We have to consider and engage with everyone's interest. It is the key for permanent recognition of our just cause. We should and can demand a referendum taking into account the world around us and end Sri Lanka's military occupation of Tamil Eelam. I thank you for your attention.